Jenna.
Great. Now.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
All right. Good morning. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you to the Creative Mornings team. Anna, thank you for coming out today this morning. So I'll jump right in. We're going to talk about corruption and creativity, give you a couple of scenes from the front lines of fighting corruption and financial crime. And we'll jump right in with a quiz. Does anyone recognize this person?
Not personally.
Not personally, okay. Anyone? Thoughts? It has been in the news sort of over the last few years. How about this guy? Yeah. All right, so as Anna was saying, my name is Max Heywood, and I've been working anti-corruption and financial crime issues since 2009 when I first came to Berlin. And I currently work for Elucidate, which happens to be 3 blocks away from here. So I bike from Weißensee 3-4 times a week to be in the neighborhood here. And we specialize in financial crime, so analyzing data to find financial crime risk, financial crime patterns, and to help companies, mostly banks, to improve their systems, to detect and to prevent financial crime. And today we'll be talking about corruption through the lens of creativity. And we'll be talking about a very specific type of corruption, which is the big kind. So the definition of corruption, which you may have heard, is it's the abuse of power for private gain. But that can include, for example, a policeman who stops you on the streets in a certain country, and you can offer them a bribe or a gift for them to not give you a speeding ticket. So this is very common in many countries, that type of sort of low-level bribery. But at the other end of the scale, you have massive levels of corruption which involve billions of dollars or euros, create massive amounts of harm to society, and that can last for years. And what we'll do is we'll start with how creativity is used to commit corruption, and then we'll see how creativity can be used to stop and detect corruption. The story is based on official documents and press stories. It covers 8 different countries at least, billions of dollars. We'll talk about bankers, we'll talk about real estate, we'll talk about luxury goods. But it all starts with the person in the picture with Leo just now, whose name is Joe Low from Malaysia. And we're starting with Joe Low because he's an example of a particular type of character that you find in corruption cases. So everyone has a certain level of material ambition and comfort that we want in our lives, right? So we say, a certain level of things that we need, of things we need to own to feel that we're comfortable, that we're satisfied with what we have. But for most of us, that level of material ambition has a limit somewhere, or we don't have the drive or the motivation to go out and really get it. So it just remains sort of a dream. I would love to have a luxury yacht. Not, my case necessarily, but we don't actually go out and get it. But at the far end of the scale, we find people who have extreme levels of material ambition. So they really feel that their identity depends on being a celebrity and having lots of luxury goods, and also have the drive and the skills and the motivation to go and get it, and also have very few ethical limits. So when you have these 3 things, extreme levels of ambition, lots of drive to go and get it, and very few limits, that's where you often find cases of corruption happening, or these types of characters involved. So this is one of the headlines of Joe Low in this story, which starts back in 2009 and continues today. So he's in the bottom corner, and that is Usher, who was at the time quite famous. And this is the type of headline that was, sorry, maybe he still is today, for the Usher fans in the house. So big spending Malaysian is the mystery man of the city club scene. So the articles mentioned, what is now standard among millionaires and billionaires, so super yachts, private jets, parties. Among other things, Joe Low once had a piano made of crystal, a transparent piano that was made in the Netherlands and shipped to his then girlfriend in the US. He allegedly once had the staff of a bar in New York flown with him to Malaysia to keep the party going, among other things. And one of the things that he did was he was the financer and the producer of the movie The Wolf of Wall Street with Leonardo DiCaprio in 2013. So he used his money to produce this movie, which is how he connected with Leo, right? Now, at the time, Joe Low, this mystery person, was in his late 20s. And one of the quotes in this article is, speculation is brewing about this mystery person, where he got his money from. And there's a quote that says, nobody spends their own money like that. It's just weird. And as we'll see, they were correct. It was pretty much more than just weird. So how did he do it? Where did the money come from? Well, if you're a person with this type of ambition and you want to get rich in this way, what do you target? Very often the answer is the state. So focus back to me, so this blue screen. To start with, governments are among the biggest buyers of goods and services in any economy, right? So if you think of the cement to make streets, to make autobahns, you think of desks and chairs for thousands of schools in a country, you think of the tanks and ships, for example, for the military, the aeroplanes, cables, telephones, almost any market that you think of, the government is one of the biggest buyers just by providing basic services to the population, right? So the government is a really, really big buyer. On top of that, you have whole markets like oil, gas, the mobile networks that we use, where the only way to get that is through a government license. This is the key thing. So you can have all the skills and the technology and the team that you want, but if you don't get that license, if someone else gets it, you will not get that business. So again, you need to depend on the government to get into that business. You also have various types of subsidies and tax breaks that you can get. And it's not a coincidence that if you look at the billionaires today, the list of the richest people in the world, many of them come from these sectors: oil and gas and technology and telephones. And you often find in their backstories, even in the tech sector, so some of the heroes of technology, of startups, have subsidies and tax breaks as part of their business models, especially in the early years, and some of them even throughout their whole careers. You know, dealing with the state is a big part of their business model. Now, there's a certain type of aspiring billionaire who goes 2 or 3 steps further, who has no intention of building an actual business with help from the state. Their goal is from the beginning to break the rules to get what they want. So there's one of the lead researchers on corruption called Graf Lambsdorff from Germany. He writes that when a person makes this decision to break the rules to make as much money as possible, it's like they go into a whole new world. It's like going into the upside down. So instead of looking at laws, they see loopholes. Instead of seeing government contracts, they see opportunities to get money into their own pockets. So they start to see the world from a completely different lens, right? And in the standard approach to corruption, it's the classic, 10% backhander. So for example, I'm a seller of chairs. I want to get a government contract. So I build a relationship with a government official, and I say to him or her, you give me this contract. We often put the price up. So instead of charging, 10 euros per chair, we're going to charge the government 20. You give me this contract with thousands of chairs, and when I get it, I will give you back 10% in some form. For example, I will buy a house for one of your children, so it's not so obvious the connection between us. So that's the classic, scheme for corruption that is quite well known. The big money, though, is in markets where there are no chairs, there are no goods and services being exchanged. It's in the financial markets. And that is where this case that we'll talk about now is coming from. So in the case of Joe Low, the story is as follows, allegedly. And I have to say allegedly because this is being filmed, and the case has not gone to trial yet for reasons we'll get into. So we know that Joe Low came from a well-off Malaysian family. He studied abroad, including in the UK. And already at a young age, he was a financial advisor to friends and family. So a bit of a whiz kid with finance at a very young age. And among his network was the stepson of the Prime Minister of Malaysia. And it's not clear how, but Joe Low leveraged his network into becoming an informal advisor. He never had a job with a government fund called 1MDB, which we'll be talking about quite a bit. So 1MDB was a special fund set up by the government of Malaysia to support tourism and agriculture and different types of business to support the development of the country. And this special fund, from quite early on, there were issues with the way it was managed. So there were, risks or rumors or stories about different people finding ways to tap into this special fund with billions of dollars that had been set up by the government of Malaysia. And if you're connected, and if you're in these social circles, and Joe Low was, and everyone else is doing it, why not join them? This is a typical personal ethical justification in cases of corruption. If everyone you know is making money in this way, why not do it yourself? Except that Joe Low stepped in and took things to a whole new level. And to explain what happened next, we're going to bring in a couple new characters who are bankers, specifically from Goldman Sachs in the Asian offices. So we have Roger Ng, also from Malaysia, and Tim Leistner, who was originally from Germany and had been working out in Asia for a long time. So Joe Low already had relationships with government officials. He had a really good local network. And now he built a relationship with Roger and Tim, and they, at some point, started working together. And the scheme that they came up with focused on international markets, and it worked something like this. So you may know that governments often issue bonds. So a way in which bonds, raise money is they issue bonds on the open market. These days you can buy them with an investment app. You can buy bonds from different countries. And when you do that, you are effectively lending that government money. And they are, over time you get some interest back onto that bond. Governments do this all the time for various purposes. So in the case of the 1MDB fund in Malaysia, it was to support agriculture and tourism and the development of the country. The thing is that these types of scheme are quite complex. It's not an easy thing to issue a bond on the open market. And so often governments ask for help. They often ask a bank or a specialist consulting firm to advise them and to support them in issuing this bond, and they get a commission or a fee, right, for this. So they get either a percentage or they get a fixed fee for arranging these billions or hundreds of millions to be released into the market, right? Now the scheme in the 1MDB case, which was what Joe Low and Roger and Tim were working on together, was they would use the fund, this 1MDB fund, this pot of money, to go out into the market and to issue bonds and to do financial transactions with the only purpose of generating the commissions. So what is usually a side effect or a sideshow, this became the main purpose of their business. They started to do financial, to get this fund to engage in financial operations purely to get commissions into their pockets. Now, a lot of people needed to be involved for this. So Joe Low was acting as the introducer. He knew the government officials. He knew who to bribe, who to convince, who to work with. And Roger and Tim, they would help to set up the deals. But crucially, they also had to get past their colleagues inside Goldman Sachs. So if you're an employee of a bank, even Goldman Sachs, even if you're very senior, you don't just send your colleagues a message on Slack and say, hey, team, today we're going to send $1 billion to the government of Malaysia. Thumbs up emoji. There's like there's documents, there's various procedures, you have to go to various committees. It's a complex issue. So a critical part of these bankers' jobs of these two characters was to get past all of these checks from their colleagues. So for example, by this point, Joe Low was in the media, so their colleagues from compliance were asking questions. Hey, hang on, Malaysia, isn't that where this Joe Low guy is? And they would say, no, he's got nothing to do with this one. This genius idea came purely for us, which of course was not true. So they kept on finding ways to bypass the controls of the bank. Over time, they found other creative ways to get money into their own pockets. For example, they set up a shell company in the British Virgin Islands, which is a shell company is a company with no staff, no actual business, no actual building, but crucially with a bank account. And so if you have an offshore company that really exists, is legally existing on paper, but with a bank account, you can transfer money to it and you can control it. So what they did was they set up the shell company in the British Virgin Islands in a name that was very similar to that of a real company that was doing business with 1MDB. And so then they could convince their people on the inside to send them money, hoping that no one would notice that the company was the name was slightly different. Yeah? So in this way, they generated over $6 billion, out of which $2 billion, so 30%, ended up in various private pockets. Their own, those are the people that they bribed. So, to put this in context, because, these numbers can be quite abstract, you probably know that an apartment in Prenzlauer Berg is about $1 million these days, like a standard one. So imagine if suddenly you can buy 50 or 60 of those in one go. The power that gives you. You can give someone a life-changing amount of money, $1 million, and you still have 59 left. So what they did was they came up with a circular scheme where the money from the first deals they would use to bribe more officials, to set up more schemes, to generate more money, to bribe more people, and to set up more deals. And in this way, they built sort of almost a global network of deals around to generate money for themselves. They kept a lot of it, and they spent the rest on parties and crystal pianos and flying people around the world, and paying for a Hollywood movie in which one of the biggest stars in the world plays a good-looking, charismatic financial operator who likes to bend the rules, or break the rules in this case. And it was this level of public exposure that eventually led to them being uncovered. So this is Claire Rucastle Brown, who is a journalist. She was born in Malaysia, actually, but with the UK background. And she was writing about a part of Malaysia called Sarawak, which has really nice tropical forests that keep getting chopped down. And this has a lot to do with corruption. So essentially, logging companies bribing or engaging in corruption to get permits or to get past the restrictions to be able to cut down the forest. And this was, the thing that she was really focused on. And 1MDB kept on coming up In her investigations, she kept finding links to 1MDB from this, relatively small part of Malaysia comparatively to the size of the country. And when she saw in the news, that the stepson of the Prime Minister, together with this 20-something person, Joe Low, was, for example, at the Golden Globes, she started to ask questions, where is the money coming from? And she wrote eventually hundreds of articles for her local paper, the Sarawak Report, a local publication. And eventually the story was picked up by the Wall Street Journal. So 2 journalists from the Wall Street Journal also started to investigate the international angle, and more stories started to appear. They eventually wrote a book called $1 Billion Whale, which I can highly recommend, which goes into great detail of this story. And there was a major breakthrough when a whistleblower from a company called Petro Saudi, that was doing business with 1MDB, handed Claire a hard drive with data which showed many of the transactions that were happening in the background. So this is Xavier Justo, who was working for Petro Saudi at the time, and he had made several attempts to raise the alarm with his colleagues. So his company was doing business with 1MDB, and he could see that things were not right. And he was ignored. So eventually he decided to go and find a journalist. He looked up Claire, who we saw just another journalist, and decided to become a whistleblower and hand her this data to help her with her investigation. These are the stories that became, at the time, this is 2013, 2014, headline news around the world, talking about this gigantic scandal in 1MDB and really creating lots of attention and making authorities also pay attention. But in the case of the Malaysian authorities, they initially decided to crack down on Xavier, the whistleblower. Instead of investigating, they accused him of stealing data. They issued a warrant for his arrest that came through when he was in Thailand, and he ended up spending a year in a Thai jail. And he has a great book that just came out called Rendezvous with Injustice. He wrote it with his wife about the impact this had on his family and how they eventually came through. And maybe a personal anecdote, which is, so I met Xavier 4 or 5 years ago at a conference in Malaysia. It was the first time that he managed to go back to the country. The government had changed, he was allowed to go back. And this conference needed a moderator to have a panel with Xavier to talk about compliance. It was a technical conference. And a couple of things just to note from that event. First was the scale. So it was 2,000 people with gigantic screens. It was pretty intense for a policy compliance person to be on that stage. And the second thing was when we came off the stage, it took us half an hour to get through the lobby. We said, let's go for a drink after the panel, which went okay. And there were journalists waiting for him. There were people waiting to take selfies, because this was a guy who had made this sacrifice to help uncover this case. So it was a moment of real vindication to be sort of standing to one side, seeing this panelist sort of being really almost like mobbed in a good way by people who really wanted to connect with him, right? So again, highly recommend his book, which just came out. So just maybe to close with a couple of thoughts. So we've looked at how corrupt individuals and networks can be creative to engage in corruption. We've looked a bit at the story of how journalists, which is also quite well known, also have to be very creative and resourceful to uncover corruption. How can we tilt the balance, though, to help the journalists and the whistleblowers, to make it easier for them to detect corruption, to make it more difficult for corrupt networks to carry out what they intend to do? Because the reality is that at the moment, unfortunately for now, the corrupt networks still have the advantage for 2 main reasons. The first is just the amount of transactions and flows that cross borders and go through the financial system every day. Trillions of dollars, millions of transactions. You can hide a lot of fraud and financial crime and corruption in those flows. And it's very, very difficult for businesses to control and to prevent and detect these types of corrupt flows, which are hidden inside this massive volume that is flowing around the world every second. The second thing, though, is that if you have enough money to start with, and as we were saying, no levels of, very low levels of ethical limits, you can outsource the creativity. So for the right price, you can find a professional money launderer. You can find, for example, a banker, an accountant, a lawyer who, for the right price, will help you to set up these schemes. So you don't have to be a financial whiz yourself. You can find someone to do the financial whizzing for you for the right price. So if we assume that we want to stop the corrupt individuals and help the whistleblowers and to help to stop their activities, one of the main things that need to happen is that governments need to invest more resources in stopping these types of crimes. So the laws in many countries are already there, but the police and the authorities that supervise the banks in almost every country are underfunded compared to the scale of what they're being asked to do. So because they're being asked to work at the national level, and these types of crimes are happening at the international level. So there needs to be a lot more resources invested in that. And I'll give you two brief examples. The first comes from our own work as a company. So we help banks to look at their systems, and we analyze their data to say, here's where you may have weaknesses in stopping your financial crime. And banks, unfortunately, in many cases still have work to do. So they simply were not built to detect these types of transactions. They were built to serve their customers and to provide loans and the usual things that banks do. Banks were not created to detect massive amounts of financial crime, which became possible thanks to the internet and to cross borders. So many of them are still playing catch up. They need to invest in their systems. The second example is when banks do invest in those systems, they do detect transactions that are suspicious. And there's something called a suspicious activity report that you may have heard of, which is an obligation that banks and other types of company have, where if they detect, for example, a very large transaction from a customer who, every month they get their salary, and then suddenly there's a gigantic transaction, that generates a red flag, and they have to support it, so they have to report it to the authorities. There's actually a system where it goes directly to, for example, to the German authorities. You log into the system and you say, hey, I want to flag this transaction from this person. I think it's suspicious for these reasons. Please look into it. In Germany, and this is public knowledge, it was in the news last year several times, the German authorities have a backlog of tens of thousands of these reports that they don't have enough people or resources to look through. So there's potentially tens of thousands of reports of financial crime in Germany that the government has not yet gotten around to report. And this is not about the German government. It's something that is common to many, many public authorities and governments around the world. So just to round off, where are they now? So this story has not ended for Leo and other celebrities. This story is from 2nd of March of this year. So there are still documents and articles coming out showing that, for example, the relationships that Joe Low built with various celebrities went a lot further than previously known, doing various types of business deals and not just movies. One of the bankers, Roger Eng, was sentenced to 10 years also 2 or 3 weeks ago, March 9th. The other banker, Timothy Leisner, settled with the authorities in the US a couple of years back. He paid back 43 million. So he actually had 43 million left to actually pay back. And Joe Low is still a fugitive. No one knows where he is. He's on the most wanted list of Interpol and all of the major police forces in the world. To this day, he has not yet appeared. And 3 years ago, he negotiated through his lawyers from a distance to pay back $700 million to the US authorities. And that's where I think we'll pause. I hope this was a useful tour. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks a lot, Max.